Players do postdoc. Thanks for coming today. Jamie did his undergrad at University of Santa Barbara with Brad Packer and his PhD at the University of Arizona. Now he's here. He's going to be working on more of the Central Asian coordinated belt with Claire. He's also working on for the PhD.
Yeah, thanks for coming today. So this project represents the Miocene half of my dissertation, in which I focused on syn-collisional gneiss-dome exhumation within the India-Asia collisional belt. And this project will soon be submitted for publication to Tectonics. It involves a collaboration between my PhD institution, the University of Arizona, decades worth of field experience from people at the Technical Mining University in Freiberg, Germany, important logistical and scientific assistance from the Tajik Academy of Sciences, and some recent help from faculty and students at the University of Alberta in Canada for some fluid inclusion work we ended up doing. So here's an outline of my talk. I'll start by introducing gneiss-domes as symptoms of orogenesis, and then move on to the Pamir gneiss-dome system and its context within the India-Asia collision zone, and then introduce the Alichur gneiss-dome complex in the South Pamir, and then focus specifically on one component of it, the Alichur dome, which we focused on in this study, and present geologic mapping, some fluid inclusion analysis, and primarily geochronology and thermochronology, which we use to bracket the timing of exhumation of this dome. And then I'll finish off with some regional tectonic implications at the scale of the Pamir gneiss-dome system, and more broadly at the scale of the India-Asia collision zone. So, gneiss-domes are essentially structural symptoms of orogenesis, and they provide diverse expressions of the geodynamics that govern their hosting origins. By definition, gneiss-domes are dome-shaped structures comprising higher-grade metamorphic and/or igneous rocks at lower structural levels that are mantled by or juxtaposed against lower-grade metamorphic and/or non-metamorphose rocks at higher structural levels. Gneiss-domes develop both within Cordillera-style origins, in which an oceanic plate subducts beneath a continental plate, and within collisional origins, in which two continental plates converge and one subducts or underthrusts beneath another. They're generally characterized by a clockwise pressure, temperature, time life cycle involving early tectonic burial and heating, followed by late exhumation and cooling. In this talk, I'm going to focus on this component, the exhumation, and so I'll describe that in more detail. One major mechanism for exhuming gneiss-domes is by shear zones, and shear zone controlled gneiss-dome exhumation boils down more or less to two categories. The first is extensional exhumation, in which the footwall of the gneiss-dome is exhumed by a normal sense shear zone, or in this case, low angle monolithic detachment, commonly with a hanging wall that's broken up by high angle normal faulting. The other mechanism for shear zone controlled gneiss-dome exhumation is by contractional shear zones. And in this case, we see that this crustal block is exhumed by synthetic conjugate reverse faults that uplift the crustal block, but require significant erosion in order to exhume the rocks. And also, I should mention that buoyancy and diapyrism, essentially anatexis and granite placement, is also an important mechanism for exhuming gneiss-domes that is not involved controlled by shear zones. And sometimes it's a chicken or egg question as to whether melting is caused by extension or vice versa. But anyway, I'm going to focus in this talk on the development of extensional gneiss-domes within collisional origins.
So would your classification, would you count something like the alpine massifs as, they sort of fit your definitions of gneiss-domes of the contractional exhumation type? Is that correct, or do you have a narrower sort of idea you're trying to get across?
So I confess my ignorance about the alpine massifs. You think the tower window or something, or?
No, I'm thinking of like the R massif, and in the Western Alps there are a bunch of lozenge-shaped, nice, high-grade metamorphic belt. No, it's not
I
a
wish
big
I
deal.
knew, but I don't.
Yeah, it's
It's
not
tricky, it
important.
is tricky to classify. But so anyways, before addressing specific gneiss domes, we'll build up their context within the Cenozoic India-Asia collision first. So the Indian and Asian continents have been colliding for 50 or 60 million years and have built Earth's thickest crust and highest plateaus and mountain chains. And notably include Tibet and the Himalaya in the west, and the Pamir in the east rather, and the Pamir, Karakoram, and Hindu Kush in the west. The Indus-Galu Sutra zone is shown here in purple, and it represents the initial point of collisional contact, and it's also a terrain boundary between Asian rocks in the north and Indian rocks in the south. Now, throughout their convergence through the entire history of collision, the Indian and Asian continents have actually converged thousands of kilometers. And early in the collisional history, the convergence rate was perhaps on the order of more than 100 millimeters per year. But that slowed down to about 34 millimeters per year today. And some of this convergence is accommodated by shortening in the Himalayan thrust belt, and in particular in the frontal Himalayan thrust belt, structurally beneath the South Tibet detachment and above the main frontal thrust, over 400 kilometers of shortening has been accommodated. Now, let's look at some broad crustal scale faults. First, we'll start with active left slip faults, namely the Chaman fault and the Altan fault. The Chaman fault accommodates northward motion of India with respect to Afghanistan, and the Altan fault accommodates westward motion of Tibet with respect to the Taran Craton. And these faults are both paired with inactive right slip strike slip faults, namely the Karakoram fault and the Herat fault in Afghanistan. And these two fault systems together have arguably accommodated eastward and westward extrusion of crust, not necessarily hundreds of kilometers, but some. And I just want to point out that in the Pamir origin in the north, it's bounded in the west by left lateral strike slip fault, in the east by right lateral strike slip fault system, and in the north by thrust system that I'll describe in more detail soon. So some notable differences between the Pamir and Tibet include salient convexity, first of all. So southern Tibet and the Himalaya have an open south-facing salient, whereas the salient for the Pamir is very tightly curved and north-facing. The elevation difference between Pamir and Tibet is also significant. Tibet is on average 5 kilometers in elevation, whereas the Pamir is on average 4 kilometers in elevation. So it's a 1 kilometer elevation difference. And two differences that I'll address in more detail are intermediate depth seismicity into the upper mantle beneath the Pamir, but not beneath Tibet, and gneiss dome abundance, which is high in the Pamir, as we can see with these green fields that represent gneiss domes in the Pamir, and the low abundance, comparatively speaking, in Tibet. So today, the Pamir and Hindu Kush are underlain by a seismic zone stretching into the upper mantle as deep as 240, perhaps 300 kilometers depth. And in this figure from a recent paper, we see earthquake hypocenter depths with green to yellow to orange to red, indicating increasing depth. So what we see beneath the Pamir is a 350 kilometer wide curviplanar arc that dips to the south or the southeast, depending on where you look along strike. And that's separated by a seismic gap from another seismic zone that's steeply north dipping beneath the Hindu Kush and more or less 150 kilometers wide. Now, it's also important to point out that low compressive wave velocities and high Poisson ratios suggest that crustal rocks have been buried to about 100 kilometers depth. So this has spurred various models of intracontinental subduction advocating a subducting Asian plate or a subducting Indian plate, or one plate or two plates. And I've honestly gone back and forth myself on this issue, but the majority of the community agrees at this point that the subduction zone beneath the Pamir represents a southward subducting Asian slab. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll ignore the slab. So modern geodynamic models to account for the seismic zone that we observe beneath the Pamir essentially boil down to two end-member models, namely rollback and delamination. So I'll address rollback first. What we have here is a cartoon from a paper by Geological and others illustrating the Hellenic slab rollback subduction system in the Mediterranean. And on the bottom, we have a perspective view of the Pamir that's oriented to match the geometry of the slab rollback subduction system and also comparisons. So in this cartoon, the European plate is in the north, and the African plate subducts northward beneath the European plate and rolls back to the south. Now, in all slab rollback subduction systems, the velocity of subduction is greater than the velocity of convergence. And what this does is it drives extension in the upper plate, and it causes the plate boundary to retreat in the direction of slab rollback. So the reason this is interesting for the Pamir is because the Pamir's pronounced curvature above this intermediate depth seismic zone, the subducting slab, is very suggestive. And if we look at this red line here, this is more or less where the Pamir seismic zone would project up to the surface. And if we treat this as an oceanic-style trench for an intercontinental subduction zone, then the logic goes that southward subducting Asian crust beneath India is occurring very rapidly and driving slab rollback and northward retreat of the overriding plate. And this predicts upper plate extension, which is consistent with extensional gneiss domes that would young in the rollback direction, and also high magnitude shortening at this quote-unquote trench, because unlike an oceanic plate, for a continental plate subducting, there's a whole sedimentary package in the upper crust that probably will subduct. So that's one end-member model. Then the other end-member model is delamination of Asia by India. Now, in this model, what we see here is continental India, continental Indian mantolithosphere and lowermost crust in blue, and Asian continental mantolithosphere and lowermost crust in green. The middle to upper crust is generally not shown, but we do have Gondwanan crust shown here in this hatched red field. And in this perspective cross-section view, what we see is that Indian mantolithosphere is underthrusting hundreds of kilometers beneath Gondwanan crust, Asian crust, and delaminating Asia at the boundary between the, let's just call it the lower crust and the middle crust, forcing subduction of Asia and giving rise to the Pamir subduction zone as we see it today. So some predictions that this makes are upper plate contraction, first of all, and if we want to relate this to the gneiss domes, it would require significant erosional exhumation. So now I'll move on to the syn-collisional extensional gneiss domes in this system. But does anyone have any questions for someone? Good.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you're calling that delamination, because in principle what is called delamination is when you thicken the mantle lithosphere to the point that it becomes negative buoyant and sinks in the mantle, which is not what you're having here. Which is not what you are representing on the graph.
I think like beneath the Sierras or something, gravitational instability.
Yeah, it's gravitational instability, which is not what you have described.
Yeah, well, this is the term that I usually use. Yeah, maybe we could call it something else. Maybe it's more of an issue of semantics. But anyways, now I'll describe the syn-collisional extensional domes in this collisional belt. So, formation of syn-collisional domes involves extensional exhumation coequal with continent-continent collision. And this falls into two categories, more or less. The first is extensional domes that are exhumed by origin-parallel extension, which is more or less perpendicular to plate convergence. So for these white arrows here, we see the white arrows indicate the dominant direction of football transport. And what we see is that that accounts for most of the gneiss dome exhumation in Tibet and some of the gneiss dome exhumation in the Pamir. Now, the other category is convergence-parallel extension, which is more or less origin perpendicular to its geometry. And that's illustrated with these yellow arrows here. And the take-home point here is that there are a significant number of domes that were exhumed by convergence-parallel extension in the Pamir and a couple in Tibet, versus very few that were exhumed by origin-parallel extension in the Pamir. So this is where I'll go in the next slide. And here we have a topographic map of the Pamir salient and gneiss dome system over. So the purples and whites represent low elevations, and the yellows and browns represent high elevations. I'll point out that the Pamir salient is bounded to the west by the left lateral active Darvaz fault, and to the north by the Pamir thrust system, which is also active, and to the east by the right lateral Kashgar-Yasheng transfer system. The other thing I'll point out before getting to the gneiss domes is that there is an active north-south striking system of normal faults that are actively accommodating east-west extension, and essentially divide the Pamir into two parts, an eastern part and a western part. The eastern Pamir is essentially a low relief, high plateau, whereas the western Pamir is characterized by much higher relief and is arguably undergoing gravitational collapse or perhaps westward lateral extrusion. So now let's move on to the gneiss domes, but first point out that the Pamir is divided from north to south into three parts: the north, central, and south Pamir, which are separated from each other by Paleozoic sutures that represent, Paleozoic to Mesozoic sutures that represent a history of terrain accretion. The gneiss domes themselves are outlined in red, and what we see is there are basically three groups: the central Pamir domes, the south Pamir domes, and the east Pamir domes in China. So what I'll show now is, with these black arrows, indicate the dominant footwall transport direction. So all the domes are uniformly bounded by extensional shear zones. That's been documented in the last 10 years with structural field investigations. And in the central Pamir, this composite belt of gneiss domes stretches around 400 kilometers from east to west and includes the Shakut, Muskol, and Saras domes, as well as the Yazulun dome. The three domes in the east are mostly at high elevation with low relief, whereas the Yazulun dome spans high relief. And there's also an unnamed and poorly documented dome in Afghanistan, which, for accessibility reasons, we don't know that much about it. In the South Pamir, we have the Shakdara Alichur gneiss dome complex, which is a composite dome characterized by divergent footwall exhumation. Going from east to west, we see that there's an increase in relief that also correlates with an increase in exhumation magnitude. And this is, I'll admit this is biased towards the Tajik component of this gneiss dome complex, because this component in Afghanistan is difficult to access, and for that reason we don't know as much about it. So integrated structural and petrologic evidence based on phase equilibrium indicates that the central Pamir domes have undergone 25 to 35 kilometers of vertical exhumation via north-south extension. The Shakdara dome has undergone a greater range and overall higher magnitude of exhumation, between 20 and 55 kilometers of vertical exhumation, but also by roughly north-south extension. And that in the East Pamir, roughly 35 kilometers of exhumation has occurred by first north-south, then east-west extension, which reflects a polygenetic evolution for this part of the gneiss dome system. For the Alichur dome, which is the topic of this study, the lithology in the dome is generally granitic, and it precludes phase equilibria-based pressure constraints. But a reasonable educated guess is that the Alichur dome represents 10 to 20 kilometers of exhumation, and the kinematics are clear that this is via north-south extension, and I'll get to that in a bit. So first, I really want to just instill an appreciation of the scale of the Shakdara Alichur gneiss dome complex. So I'm going to show two images at the same scale in Google Earth. So this is the greater LA area with Caltech label. And then here is the Shakdara Alichur gneiss dome complex. It stretches, if you were to superimpose Shakdara Alichur on LA, it stretched from the Channel Islands in the west to the Salton Sea in the east. So this as far as I'm aware, this is Earth's largest Cenozoic gneiss-dome. So, okay, so here is a topographic map of the Shakdara-Alichur gneiss-dome complex. These colored symbols indicate exhumation depth estimates ranging from 50 or 60 in red to as low as 20 in blue. And what I want to point out is that the Shakdara Dome is bounded to the south by the top to the south, normal sense, South Pamir shear zone, which exhumed the Shakdara Dome to the north-northwest from, again, 20 to 55 kilometers depth. For the Alichur Dome, it's bounded by the top to the north, normal sense, Alichur shear zone, which exhumed the Alichur Dome to the south-southwest from 10 or 20 kilometers, we don't really know. These two domes are separated by the Turumtai Graben, which is a low-strain block of crust that was obviously deformed little, given that it's low strain, and exhumed very little in comparison to the domes. The Gut shear zone bounds the Shakdara Dome to the north and has it records an early history of top to the north shear, similar to the Alichur shear zone, but has been strongly overprinted by dextral transgressive kinematics that make it a real mess and difficult to. The earlier phase of this shear zone is very difficult to elucidate, and Gut and Alichur shear zones may have been connected, but it's ambiguous at best at this stage. So now I'm going to show two field photos to illustrate the asymmetry in the South Pamir. One from here in the central Pamir, the central South Pamir shear zone, and one here to the east along strike. So here they are. This is the photo from the eastern part of the South Pamir shear zone. And what we see is very well-developed foliation. So first of all, we're looking off to the west in this image and in this image, and we see well-developed foliation from at least a kilometer distance, and perhaps even SC fabrics at this mega outcrop scale. Here in the bottom photo, we have another view of the South Pamir shear zone, also looking off to the west, so the shear zone is dipping off to the south, with very poorly developed foliation. And now I'll present two closer outcrop photos. So this is a outcrop photo representing more or less the same location that's photographed here. And what we see is that Cape Feldspar and quartz are ductile, indicating broadly high diffraction temperatures and strain, whereas for the eastern locality of the South Pamir shear zone, this is what you get when you try and measure foliation, lineation, etc. The quartz is minimally ductile and very little deformed, indicating low deformation temperatures and low strain. So at this longitude, gneiss-dome exhumation is instead accommodated by the Alichur shear zone. So not only is there this asymmetry along the strike, but there's asymmetry in terms of the direction of footwall exhumation in the South Pamir. So let's look at the timing of burial and exhumation for the Shakdara Dome first. This is a series of probability density plots. Age is the time is going forward to the left on the x-axis here. And here is a legend for all these ages. So in general, in pink and corresponding to the probability density plots on top, we have compiled age interpretations for geopetrochronologic ages for ages that are interpreted to represent anatexis, mostly prograde to peak metamorphism, and mostly retrograde metamorphism. Here in a bunch of different colors are additional probability density plots for thermochronologic cooling ages, mostly for the white mica and biotite argon system, but also for zircon helium and apatite fission track with a significant number of ages. And what we see is that the timing of prograde metamorphism for the Shakdara Dome spans on the order of 37 to 21 MA, and the timing of exhumation-related cooling and retrograde metamorphism spans 22 to 2 MA. So now let's put this on a map. We can just add this temporal context to the exhumation of the dome. Now we know that it was exhumed from 22 to 2 MA, and this occurred at about 3 kilometers per million years. And for the Alichur Dome, until this study, we didn't know, so that was part of the motivation for this study. So now, in the next slide, I'll show a geologic map of the Alichur Dome. Here it is. So what I want to point out first is that the Alichur shear zone is shown here in pink, and in red is the detachment fault at the uppermost structural level of the Alichur shear zone. And again, the Alichur shear zone is a top to the north top to the north-northeast, normal sense myelinatic shear zone that's corrugated. It's bent into a syn form right here, and two counterpart. It's bent into it's corrugated into an antiform along its axis right here, parallel to lineation, and into syn forms here and here. And so I'll just mention the lithology and the hanging wall and the footwall then. So the hanging wall is comprised of Permian to Jurassic strata in brown and blue, which are intruded by Jurassic to Cretaceous continental arc granitoids in red. So that's the hanging wall in the north, and then the footwall in the south includes the same Jurassic to Cretaceous continental arc granitoids, as well as additional pegmatites, but with the additional presence of pervasive early Miocene leucogranites. The entire footwall of this dome is pervasively intruded by an early Miocene leucogranite injection complex that is more or less parallel to the Alichur shear zone within it and close to it. And going to the south towards the core of the dome, the volume fraction of leucogranite increases and it becomes more chaotically oriented overall. So now I'll show a cross-section across the Alichur dome. It's pretty simple geology. So south is on the west, south is on the left, and north is on the right. And we see the hanging wall with the continental arc granitoids intruding the cover rocks. And then in the footwall, this is the Alichur shear zone that's juxtaposing the hanging wall and footwall. And then just schematically illustrated all of the leucogranites that pervasively intrude this footwall of the dome.
May I ask you a question?
Yep.
When you have this section, in the back of the section, so how could you exclude here that this could be a horizontal shear zone? So that's the, well, you interpret that as a normal fault, right?
Yes.
On top of the dome.
Yep.
Yeah. How do you exclude that it could be a horizontal shear zone that would have been, exhumed due to folding, broad scale folding, duplex formation, things like that?
Horizontal shear zone that's been folded.
Yeah.
Well, there's a cooling age offset between the footwall and hanging wall, which is consistent with the pattern that's indicated. Are you thinking maybe of the North Himalayan ice domes? I think are essentially a folded shear zone. For those domes, from what I remember, aren't the cooling ages consistent across the dome for the Argon system? Or I haven't thought about those domes in detail for a while.
But here you have a difference of thermobarometric constraint that clearly indicate the normal inversion on that fault. You're confident about it.
Thermobarometric constraints?
Yes.
Well, no. The lithology in this dome is basically worthless for thermobarometry because the helpful minerals that we need, like garnet and so on and so forth, don't grow. They go in the leucogranite, but they're not coated with other minerals that would help us estimate pressures. But what we did as the next best alternative was do fluid inclusion analyses. But yeah, I guess it's mostly the kinematics observed in the field, so non-coaxial, top to the north, normal sense shear, as well as the cooling age offset that makes me confident that it's not simply a folded shear zone. But that's something that's a really important question to ask. So yeah, I'll show a few field photos now. So first photo is going to be from this location looking off to the east. And what we see here is the Alichur shear zone as it bends to the north as you move to the east. And this is due to a corrugation syncline, which is generally consistent with a high magnitude of stretching. So the footwall is on the right, and the hanging wall is on the left. And what we'll look at now is an up-close outcrop photo showing syn-kinematic boudinage early Miocene leucogranite, also with the same kinematics, so top to the north-northwest. And then I'll show some images, some photos of leucogranites within the core of the dome. This cliff face is mostly leucogranite. So what I've outlined here in yellow is the country rocks, the Jurassic to Cretaceous arc rocks. And everything else that's lighter in color is Miocene leucogranite. So here at this part of the dome in the core, there's more than half of the dome is Miocene leucogranite. It's just enveloped all the country rocks. And here is a cross-cutting relationship from a nearby location of Cretaceous magmatite that's cross-cut by early Miocene leucogranite. And yep.
The ages of the leucogranite, is that uranium lead or?
Yeah, zircon, uranium lead. Yep. And the magmatite is also uranium lead, zircon. And then here is, I'll just show one more photo of the leucogranite injection complex in another context where it's more of a dike swarm as opposed to something that envelops all the country rocks. So, yeah, so to circumvent this issue of rocks that are worthless for thermobarometry at phase equilibria, what we did was we did the next best thing, and we conducted fluid inclusion analysis. And the goal was to constrain exhumation depths for the eastern part of the Shakhtara Alichur dome. And this is the location of the 3 rocks that we analyzed, 1 from the Alichur shear zone and 2 from the South Pamir shear zone. And then here they are. They're thick sections, one myelinitic and the other 2 gneissic, but all from the shear zones that bound the structure. These holes that are drilled out of this are from some experimental work that we did with in situ argon dating. So they're unrelated to the fluid inclusion analysis. But what's important here is that the fluid inclusions were hosted, still are hosted, in secondary assemblages tracing field fractures and cross-cut grain boundaries. So these aren't fluid inclusions that record the primary crystallization of any of these minerals. It's related to deformation. And yeah, the pressure estimates that the fluid inclusion data is pretty complicated, and the best we can do is come up with a crude pressure estimate based on these data, but it's consistent with the broad geologic trend nevertheless. So what we get is 5 kilobar estimate for the sample from the central eastern South Pamir shear zone, which is based on projecting this isochore, for this set of isocores for this sample to maximum pressure, and on the order of 2 to 3 kilobars for samples from the eastern South Pamir shear zone and the Alichur shear zone in the north. So again, this is broadly consistent with the expected eastward decrease in pressure and temperature across this composite gneiss dome. So let's just put these on a map. So what we have now is maximum pressure estimates on the order of 20 kilometers, then 10 kilometers as you move farther east, and on the order of less than 8 kilometers for the Alichur shear zone itself.
It's very rare to get fluid inclusions that preserve really high pressure without rupturing.
Okay.
And your 19 is it's right up against the limit, where if you tried to enclose a 30 kilometer inclusion, it would probably degravitate. So I'm not sure it's a really good upper limit.
What would you?
You have evidence of at least 19. I would call it lower than that. You can't exclude that it was trapped higher.
Well, the fluid inclusion people tell me that it's a reasonable upper limit. And I'll confess that I'm not an expert with fluid inclusion analysis. This was something opportunistic to try and obtain to obtain some quantitative estimates. So yeah, I'll confess that they're not as high quality as the traditional phase equilibrium estimates, but nevertheless, take it for what it's worth. It's consistent with an eastward decrease in exhumation depths across this gneiss dome complex. Moving on. When was the Alichur dome exhumed? Well, we figured this out with radiometric dating. So we implemented geochronology to date leucogranite injection to bracket the onset of exhumation, because these leucogranites from the textures observed in the field were placed syn-kinematically. And we used the uranium lead zircon chronometer for that. And then with thermochronology, we date cooling through 400 to 100 degrees Celsius, mainly with the, estimate closure temperatures using software written by Mark Brandon. And we primarily implemented the argon mica chronometers and the uranium, thorium, helium, zircon thermochronometer and the appetite vision tract chronometer. So here's another set of probability density plots with cooling or crystallization age as the x-axis, with time going forward to the left. And what we see overall is that the Alichur dome leucogranites crystallized and the Alichur dome subsequently cooled from a range of 23 to 5 MA exclusively during the Miocene. Overall, this indicates fast cooling. The Alichur dome hanging wall and Turin-Tigraben, by contrast, crystallized and cooled over a much longer time frame, broadly indicating slow cooling. So now let's look at crystallization and cooling ages and compare Shakhtara and Alichur to each other. So again, here they are. This is a probability, a series of probability density plots with the pinks generally representing ages of anatexis, or in the case of Shakhtara, prograde or retrograde metamorphism. But in the Alichur dome, it's exclusively for anatexis. And the results are broadly that leucogranite crystallization in the Alichur dome spans 23 to 16 MA, constraining the time of leucogranite injection, and we interpret it to bracket the onset of exhumation of this dome. The lower temperature thermochronometers span 16 to 5 MA and constrain exhumation and cooling from about 400 to 100 degrees Celsius, and with cooling rates of on the order of 30 degrees Celsius per million years that I'll show in a couple slides. By comparison to the Shakhtara dome, the timing of magnetization and leucogranite magnetism span a much wider range, from 30 to 11 MA, and that's actually not correct, more like 39 to 11 MA, and cooling, by comparison, span 22 to 2 MA, indicating retrograde metamorphism and just broadly exhumation and cooling of the dome. And this equates to faster cooling rates for the Shakhtara dome comparison. And the interesting thing that I'd like to point out here is that liquidization in the Shakhtara dome, if you look at this dome in the field, there is so much anatectism evident. There are really high temperature migmatites, all kinds of restite. So a significant amount of melt generated that I argue rose buoyantly through the crust and was emplaced in the equivalent of the Alichur dome along strike. So that's my interpretation for the origin of the leucogranites in the Alichur dome. So yeah, as far as constraining cooling rates for the Alichur dome, we used isoplot to generate single sample cooling rate regressions through intermediate to low temperatures. And just here's one example. Temperature on the y-axis and time on the x-axis for, this is an ortho-nice sample from the Alichur dome. And we have a zircon uranium lead age here, 2 argon mica ages here, and an appetite vision tract age here. And we didn't use it's hard to draw any conclusions from a regression from zircon uranium lead, which represents crystallization through intermediate temperature cooling. So we just used the intermediate to low cooling rate regressions for single samples, and took all of the samples for the Alichur dome and for other structural domains, and took the weighted mean. So this is a plot of cooling rates for all of the different domains in the Alichur dome region. And I just want to point out that for the Alichur dome, this is the weighted mean. We wind up with 30 degrees Celsius per million years for the Alichur dome itself, around 7 degrees Celsius per million years for the Gunn shear zone, and much lower, slower cooling rates for the Turin-Tigraben and the Alichur dome hanging wall. So we also computed exhumation rates. We have to make some assumptions here. We landed on broadly 1 kilometer per million year exhumation rate. Now, one problem with the Alichur dome is that the relief is very low, and we don't have any samples that span an elevation age transect. So what we did is we made some assumptions and normalized cooling ages to a common closure temperature, which doesn't change the cooling age very much. You have to assume a cooling rate for that, prescribed cooling rate. And we also corrected for distance to the Alichur detachment. The most significant spatiotemporal cooling age trend within the Alichur dome itself is an increase in cooling ages away from the detachment. So here's an example for the white mica argon system. The dashed ellipses represent non-normalized cooling ages, and the solid ellipses represent normalized cooling ages. And what we see is we ended up with, for this instance, we ended up with two regressions, either 1.6 or 0.7 kilometers per million years, depending on which samples we exclude or include. Similar result for biotite argon, similar result for zircon helium, and lower cooling rate for apatite fission track, although this sample set is generally not as reliable as the higher temperature chronometers. So overall, we're satisfied with the 1 kilometer per million year bulk exhumation rate estimate for the Alichur dome. Now, we'll just add this to the map. So the Shakhtar dome, again, exhumed from 22 to 2 MA very quickly, and the Alichur dome was exhumed from as early as 23 to 16 MA to 5 MA at about 1 kilometer per million years, or 30 Celsius per million years. The gum shear zone, by comparison, was exhumed at about 1 kilometer per million years, and then the graben between the two domes, as well as the Alichur dome hanging wall, were exhumed very slowly. So here's all the data from bedrock for the Pamir gneiss dome system. It's a mess. There's way too much data that you could never discuss all this in a single talk. But I just want to point out before I clean it up that we have the East Pamir domes on top, the Central Pamir domes in the middle, and the South Pamir domes on the bottom. And the x-axis represents time going forward to the left. So now what we're going to do is clean this up by using the best chronometer for intradome exhumation timing comparison, which is the white mica and biotite argon cooling ages. And the reason that they're the best is because the analytical precision is the highest for these ages, and there's simply the greatest number of data points. We ran the most samples in general between our study and other studies for the Pamir. So this is the best means of comparing cooling for the Pamir gneiss dome system, is through the white mica and biotite argon cooling range. So what we see is that the Central Pamir domes cooled from 18 to 13 MA through argon mica closure. The South Pamir domes cooled from 16 to 11 MA for the Alichur dome, and 19 to 5 MA for the Shakhtar dome. And then the East Pamir domes cooled from 14 to 2 MA for Musagada, and then really recently from 5 to 1 MA for the Convergence-parallel dome. Let's put this on the map. So again, we're looking at the Pamir gneiss dome system with the dominant footwall transport directions for these domes illustrated by black arrows and green arrows for actively exhuming, for active gneiss dome exhumation in the East Pamir. In the Central Pamir, the domes cooled through argon mica closure at 18 to 13 MA. Alichur cooled from 16 to 11 MA. Shakhtar cooled from 19 to 5 MA. And then Musagada and Convergence cooled from 14 to 2 MA and very quickly for Musagada, and 5 to 1 MA for Convergence, also very quickly. The reason I've outlined Musagada in red is because it reflects a polygenetic evolution. The early range of these ages reflect north-south extension as an extension of the Central Pamir gneiss dome system, which was then overprinted by east-west extension, which is exhuming all of the Convergence dome and some of the Musagada dome. So, take-home message here is that there's a documented southward propagation of north-south extension followed by east-west extension. So, let's get back to some of our original ideas and questions here. So did the Pamir gneiss domes and salient form by northward underthrusting of India? Well, all the domes are documented to have been exhumed by extensional shear zones, and uniform cooling of the Central Pamir domes through this argon mica closure range suggests that erosion was secondary, if at all. So that doesn't really make sense. And well, what about southward subduction and northward rollback of Asia? Well, the problem with this is that the documented southward propagation of north-south extension is the reverse of the trend predicted by this geodynamic model. So we got to rethink this and propose an alternate mechanism for southward propagating gravitational potential energy surplus to account for this pulsive, significant exhumation across the Pamir. And the problem with these two models is that they're focused so much on the modern framework that we observe seismologically, but this is only the most recent configuration. So this is a paper by DeSells and others, and it's based on a study in Tibet documenting Miocene extension in the Kailas Basin. But I just want to point out this series of time slices extending through the entirety of the India-Asia collision. And what I want to point out is this dynamic history of different phases of Indian underthrusting, followed by Indian rollback and slab breakoff. So we don't need to focus on the modern framework. I think that these other geodynamic models are just myopic. So how about southward rollback of India? That's the geodynamic model that I'll propose with this series of figures here. So what I'm going to show here is I'll zoom in on these two broad time slices in the following slides. But what we have is an episode of Indian rollback from 22 to 8 M8, more or less, followed by a subsequent history of Indian underthrusting to the north from perhaps 7 M8 to the modern day. So let's go to the first series of time slices first. So again, India is outlined in blue, in green, and Asia is outlined in blue. This is Asian mantle lithosphere, and Indian mantle lithosphere, and Asian crust, and Indian crust. And what I'll do to make the time progression of this easier to interpret is just crudely draw the first time slice at the beginning, or the onset of this rollback phase at about 22 MA. At this time, the Pamir crust is at a maximum thickness on the order of 90 kilometers, and India starts rolling back to the south, leaving a partially bulldozed Asian mantle lithosphere wedge. And this results in the upper crust of the upper plate, the Asian upper plate, being thrown from compression into extension with a vertical sigma 3 to a vertical sigma 1. Moving on to the next time slice, the intermediate phase of this episode of slab rollback, illustrated by this thick green line, we see that the subducting Indian slab is rolling back to the south, maybe at 30 or 50 kilometers per million years, and that there's a southward propagation of north-south extension in the Asian upper plate, illustrated it's consistent with the principal stress orientation of a vertical sigma 1 and north-south sigma 3. So this is propagating to the south, and this is what I argue is responsible for the rapid exhumation of the central Pamir domes and the south Pamir domes. And then at the end of this rollback phase, this is when somewhere around 8 MA or perhaps 10 MA, the Indian slab stops rolling back, and I argue that continued slab pull puts this slab under tension, and this results in the onset of necking in the Indian slab. And this is also when the central Pamir domes stopped exhuming, but gneiss dome exhumation continued in Shaktara. Moving on to the next phase of Indian underthrusting, I'll do the same thing, but in two highlighted time slices. So in the first time slice, perhaps starting around 7 M8, first of all, the lower Indian slab breaks off and founders into the mantle. And the upper Indian slab, for that, I argue that stored electric flexural potential energy is converted into kinetic energy and drives continued northward Indian underthrusting at intractably shallow levels. And what we see in the next time slice that represents the modern configuration, the Indian slab is underthrusting northward at the geodetic rate that we observe today, around 35 kilometers per million years. And India is bulldozing and delaminating Asia at the lower to middle crustal boundary, and this results in a rotation of principal stress orientations driving east-west extension in the Asian crust with vertical sigma 1 and north-south sigma 2, and that's consistent with the exhumation of the convergence-parallel dome in the East Pamir. Anything? All right, almost done here. So, all right, so these are our conclusions. So, syn-collisional gneiss dome exhumation, the Alichur dome was exhumed between 23 to 16 and 5 MA through intermediate to low temperatures at around 1 kilometer per million years. we've documented a southward propagation of north-south extension from the central Pamir to the south Pamir, and then after that, cross-cutting east-west extension is what is exhumed the convergence-parallel dome and part of the Musabala dome in the east Pamir, and that's related to presumed Indian underthrusting and lateral extrusion that characterizes the modern strain regime in the Pamir today. Also, the development of this northward convex salient it's still in question whether this occurred coevally with southward Indian slab rollback. This is the opposite of the pattern predicted by oceanic slab rollback. So it's not clear whether or not Indian slab rollback, well, I guess it's unlikely that Indian slab rollback is responsible for the northward convexity of the Pamir salient, given the fact that the geometry is the opposite of what we would expect. And finally, this might be the most interesting thing. We observed high magnitude extension, more or less parallel to plate convergence. And an implication of this is that perhaps the shortening rate in the Himalaya exceeds the India-Asia convergence rate to date. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you. Nobody's here that I'm thanking, but a lot of people helped me with this project, and I wouldn't have been here today to talk about it without everyone. So thanks for listening. Any questions? Yes.
Is there any Miocene age basaltic magmatism that would provide support for this idea of a stenospheric upwelling at the end of your northward subduction of the Indian lithosphere? You then pull back and draw in 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers of the stenospheric ascent. Is there any evidence that you produce partial melting during this period?
Well, you asked about basaltic melts.
Because that would indicate something happening in the steanosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not aware of any basaltic magmatism during the late Cenozoic in the Pamir whatsoever. But there's certainly widespread crustal melting, which is consistent with the transmission of a heat wave resulting from the stenospheric upwelling. And yeah, I mean, you could look at, for instance, hafnium and zircon signatures for glucogranites of this age, but this is speculative. This is not documented based on any actual evidence.
Well, the main point is this southward age progression in the exhumation.
That's the motivation for the model.
And how does the granite fit the story here?
You're asking what were the order?
The timing of the granite when they fall, right? Is it decompression melting during the extension phase, or how does it fit in the story?
It's hard to say. The timing of Anatexis in the Shakdara dome overlaps with both prograde metamorphism and retrograde metamorphism. So at best we can say that either crustal thickening related prograde metamorphism or decompression, partial melting, or a heat wave from the mantle, that they could all be responsible for the Anatexis. So it's hard to tell what origin is.
And what would drive the rollback of the continental lithosphere? It's not common, right, to invoke rollback of continental lithosphere.
Drive, rollback.
I
don't know what would drive rollback. I don't know what would drive rollback itself. Normally,
well, for oceanic lithosphere, it's easier. For continental lithosphere, once it does.
well, one shortcoming of this figure is that it's focused on the Pamir, and we don't really discuss much what's happening in the Himalaya. But one assumption here is that basically the middle and upper crust has been scraped off of the underthrusting Indian plate, and is it paper by Capitano and others from 2009 or something, where they they quantitatively modeled this and showed, I think perhaps quantifying something that's obvious, but by scraping off the middle and upper crust of a continental atmospheric slab that's cold,
It's easier to susceptible.
But I don't know why that would happen at this time. I don't have an answer to that.
Should that be any different from just delamination of continental lithosphere? It can be just another different style of delamination, right? Which is,
Well, you need to have thickened the lithosphere enough that, or, yeah.
yeah, and it's just, anybody's image.
Yeah, with rollback systems and oceanic systems, today we just know that it's rolling back. So it's, this is different because it is something that we're speculating reasonably so perhaps, but we're definitely speculating that it happened in the past. And for a continental slab, not for an oceanic slab. But I guess the two factors favoring subduction of continental crust, Indian continental crust, are the fact that it's old and cold, and the likelihood that it's, perhaps most of the crust is scraped off and shortened in the Himalayan crust belt. It's 400 kilometers of documented, a minimum of 400 kilometers of documented shortening since throughout the Miocene in the frontal Himalayan folding crust belt. So I think it's reasonable to pontificate
It's happening all along the front of the high Himalaya, the Himalayan rocks. So why is it that here it would roll back and not elsewhere?
you're asking why this would,
Why is it
I'm not sure your question.
why is it that the Indian lithosphere would have rolled back
yeah.
in that area, whereas elsewhere along the Himalayan arc you had as much shortening and it didn't happen?
Well, this has been proposed in Tibet, so westward, eastward, long strike. Come on. Here we go. So, this was proposed in this southward rollback of Indian continental lithosphere during the Miocene was proposed for, here we go, 32 to 25 ME. So not during the Miocene, but the middle Cenozoic was proposed based on sedimentologic evidence in Tibet. The timings, I realize, are different, but
It's the opposite because you have the breakup before the rollback.
yes. Yeah, well, I mean,
So it's more difficult.
yeah, it's very, trying to integrate the geodynamic scale evolution of Indian underthrusting and rollback along strike from Tibet to the Pamir is, very problematic. Sure. But it's just something that comes to mind as an attractive mechanism for a surplus of stored gravitational potential energy to drive extension and exhumation. But the theory isn't without its holes, or the hypothesis rather. Any other questions?
Okay, well, let's thank Jamie again.